Right, we are going to reconvene our meeting and welcome Liz Thompson, ecologist. Welcome, Liz.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I'm grateful to be here. Thank you so much for having me in this morning. I want to start. Shall I just go ahead, Madam Chair?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to start by telling you who I am, explaining who I am. I'm Elizabeth Thompson. I go by Liz, and I live in Jericho. I've been in Vermont for a little more than 40 years. I am retired now from the Vermont Land Trust. So I just want to clarify, originally the agenda said that I was the Director of Conservation for the Vermont Land Trust. I have retired from that position as of the end of December. So I am currently an independent ecologist, but I worked for many years for the Vermont Land Trust, also for the Nature Conservancy, and as a contractor for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. Throughout my entire career, I have been actively involved in large-scale conservation planning. So I'm here to basically support the bill as drafted, H126, and I'm very excited to see it brought forward. I'm also grateful to my predecessor, Dr. Rebozo, for really setting a good stage for what I'm about to talk about and answering all the hard questions. So I'll try to take off from there. He spoke about the, what, and the things you asked. What is biodiversity? And why should we care about it? Why should humans care about it? And I think that what I have to offer here is perhaps a little bit of reflection on those things, but also some practical solutions for going forward to protect biological diversity. I'm going to share my screen now and talk to you about, and I'll just if you have feedback on the display, let me know. But okay, great. But if I can, I'd like to just talk about conserving biological diversity in Vermont, and starting with this, which is just sort of a reiteration of what you heard earlier, which is that we have a large number of species in Vermont, somewhere between 24,000 and 43,500 is a number, an estimate, absolute estimate. But the point is of this is a couple of points of this chart, and this is from Vermont Conservation Design. This is to show that we have vertebrate animals, which are bear, deer, birds, fish, etc., comprise a very small piece of the pie, a very small percentage of the actual species we have in Vermont. Fungi, a huge proportion. Invertebrate animals, the largest proportion of organisms that we have in Vermont. And the number is vague because we just don't know, as was said earlier, we just don't know how many of each of these species we have. We know how many vertebrate animals, pretty certainly. We know sort of how many lichens. We have an approximate idea how many mosses and liverworts, but some of the other groups we just don't know. And fungi in particular occur underground. There's so much we don't know. And this is why we need to protect landscapes, to protect all the species that we don't know about. And that was said earlier, and I want to just reiterate that. It's critically important that we understand that there's so much to know, and we cannot protect each species one by one. So instead we use a landscape approach. So what do we need to protect? First of all, let me just define biodiversity again, because it was asked the other day or yesterday, I heard the question. It is the variety of life in all its forms and all the interactions between living things and their environment. It includes ecosystem diversity, landscape diversity, community diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. So at all scales. And what is needed to protect biological diversity? We need a resilient and connected landscape. We need a system of waters and lands and waters that are connected and protected in such a manner as to promote full ecological function. And this includes at least the following elements. We need ecological reserves, and these need to be, many of them need to be large. We need natural areas, which are sort of like ecological reserves, protected as for biological diversity solely, but they're generally smaller. Stewardship lands, which are lands that are responsibly managed. Many of our forest lands fall into this category. And then connecting lands or linkages, which can take many forms, but sometimes they're riparian areas, sometimes they take other forms. Healthy farmlands, and then semi-wild urban and suburban places. Oops. Excuse me, sorry. So ecological reserves are needed to protect some of the things that and this is discussed in the bill, but ecological reserves are needed to protect some features like old growth forests and state significant natural communities like this dry oak maple limestone forest. Some of these really need to be protected at the highest level in ecological reserves, which are managed strictly for biological diversity and where natural ecological processes can take place. So trees can grow old and die, they can fall down to the forest floor, and they can store and sequester and store carbon in the most effective way. We also need some smaller, perhaps smaller natural areas, and these could be called ecological reserves too, but just on a smaller scale. And this is, for example, this is Peacham Bog in Groton State Forest, which is a state designated natural area. And I'll use this photo also to point out that in some cases, the natural areas that are designated and called natural areas are actually not permanently protected. So the bill calls for permanent protection. It defines conservation as permanent protection. And not all of our natural areas are permanently protected. This is important to know. But this is Peacham Bog. It's a special natural area, and it is currently protected. Here is Chickering Bog, which is a smaller peatland, and it is permanently protected by the Nature Conservancy. This is a group of students on a boardwalk in Chickering Bog. And these places provide so many ecological functions, as well as educational and recreational functions. And they protect rare plants like this twig rush. And they offer access like this this is not a rare plant, this is sheep laurel, but it's growing right through the boardwalk in Colchester Bog, a lovely little natural area in Chittenden County in our most populated area of the state. This is Calypso orchid, which also needs special protection in natural areas. Unfortunately, this has not been seen in many years, in at least a couple decades. So we also need stewardship lands that are responsibly managed, carefully managed to produce timber products and other products. And this is a group of foresters in a managed forest land in southern Vermont. That's Tony D'Amato in the center. We need connecting lands or linkages, and this is the Missisquoi Delta. Connecting lands are not always riparian areas, but as I said, they often are. And we need healthy farmlands, and this is a farmer in Colchester at the Pine Island Community Farm, in a field that is being managed partly for natural features and partly to support goats. And we need semi-wild urban and suburban places like this, in my very own neighborhood. Simply a lawn that has been let go, and monarch butterflies are enjoying it. Vermont conservation design is a practical scientific vision for sustaining Vermont's ecologically functional landscape into an uncertain future. It applies a coarse filter, fine filter approach, which I've alluded to a little bit. It uses simple, recognizable features, and it depends upon thoughtful stewardship and management. Now I'm going to go back to this idea, and this is part of what Vermont conservation design does, but this image is from an earlier report of the Vermont Biodiversity Project going back about 20 years, showing that an ideal system of ecological reserves would have core reserves, and these are ecological reserves surrounded by stewardship lands or carefully protected lands. And here's where I show what the natural areas are, perhaps tinier areas, smaller areas, scattered perhaps even within urban or agricultural areas, and then connecting lands. And then looking regionally, go ahead. Did you have a question? Okay.
I didn't see one. Well, what we do, Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. It's more a question for you. You had mentioned that we were going to get sort of a full overview of Vermont conservation design. Is that this, or is that going to be something else?
I think it's going to be something else.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I will also say that I will not be fully covering Vermont conservation design here, and I do expect that you will hear much more depth about that in a future session. So great. But in any case, here I want to just show you that we are not isolated here in Vermont. That obviously, so we look at the regional picture as well, and this is a nice regional look at where Vermont sits. And this is actually focused on the state of Maine. I'm borrowing this slide from somewhere else, but you can see that the linkage areas, several key wildlife linkage areas are identified. This has been mentioned in the bill and by you and others formerly, but you can see those yellow arrows that show where Vermont sits in this larger wildland landscape. And then here is, going back to Vermont conservation design, here is the design for an ecologically functional landscape. And this covers around 66–67% of the state of Vermont, which is not meant to say that all of those lands should be permanently protected, but all of those lands need protection in some way or another to protect the ecologically functional landscape in Vermont. And again, you will hear much more detail about how this was put together and devised by someone else. So, but a question is, how much is enough? How much conservation land is enough, and how much do we have? So we want to think about the kinds of land protection and the different tools. And I've heard you talk about different land protection tools earlier, about easements and so forth, and also the question of permanency. I'm delighted to see that the definition of conservation in the bill is one of permanent protection. And I think that is critical. As I mentioned earlier, there are lands that are designated as natural areas and wildlands that don't have permanent protection, and that needs to be given some attention. So how much is enough? Well, you've been talking about that, but the Vermont Climate Action Plan, of course, talks about 30 by 30, and that's what this bill calls for, and then 50 by 50, 50% of the landscape by 2050, 30% by 2030, and 50% by 2050. And so the other comment, I guess, that I have heard is that then at the bottom here, I say, cite Half Earth, which is an organization that calls for 50% of protection of the planet. So all these different ideas have been out there and have made it into the public discourse, which is a really amazing thing, and I support it fully. We can't. We have work to do to get toward these targets. As someone earlier has said, the devil is in the details, and you have called for those details to be looked at closely in the bill, so that that work will be done. It is work, and it needs to be done. So a little bit about how much we do have. We actually don't know how much we have of each of those categories that are listed in the bill. The three that are called for or defined: ecological reserve areas, biodiversity conservation areas, and natural resource management areas. So the bill calls for those to be evaluated. But those three categories, as I understand it, are meant to sort of mirror the USGS gap analysis program. So, so those GAP categories, there are 4 categories of protection. And those categories of protection have been used to look at conservation lands up until now and will continue to be used. But those data, I will say, are incomplete. The data that make up that any protected lands database that you look at presently has incomplete data on the GAP status. So they're not reliable. And so the work really needs to be done to look more closely at that. Now, I'm going to just show you though some estimates of what we think we might have, and then this one actually is going back to the Vermont Biodiversity Project. This is a 2002 map, and but it's useful and also it's useful in that its legend defines what these 4 classes are. So class 1 lands are managed in their natural state, such that natural disturbance regimes are allowed to occur and natural resource extraction is prohibited. Whereas class 2 lands are managed for their natural values primarily, but may receive uses that somewhat degrade the quality of the natural communities present. And this could include things like potentially controlling invasive species, managing for particular species, habitat needs, maintaining roads, those sorts of things. And I did hear some discussion about roads yesterday. Class 3 lands are protected from permanent conversion to non-natural uses, but are subject to extractive uses. So many of our managed forests are in that category. Whereas class 4 lands are managed in ways that may preclude natural cover and the presence of native plant and animal assemblages. And many of our farmlands would fall into that class. So you can see in this map that, and, you know, don't pick at it too much because there's a couple of errors in it that have been since corrected. But and this is the nature of this kind of work. It's hard to define these classes sometimes. But you can see, for example, in the northwestern part of the state, very near where I live right on the west side of that big red blob, which is class 4. That is the Jericho Underhill firing range. It's a fabulous natural area. It's a beautiful, there's many, many natural communities in there that are protected actually, but being what it is, it does not have permanent protection and it can be converted at any time. And many of our farmlands show up as red in the Champlain Valley. Those are lands that are in non-natural cover now.
Representative Smith has a question.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. That map that we're looking at right now is a Biodiversity Project 2002. That was 21 years ago. Do you have something that's like 2022 or?
As a matter of fact, I do. Hang on.
I'd like to see a comparison.
Yeah. It's the reason I'm showing you this is partly for that comparison, and partly because this is a good display of the protection class. But yes, absolutely, this is old data, and things have changed. But sticking with this for a second, Vermont Biodiversity Project 2002. Here you can see a pie chart of the different classes of conserved land at that time. So just take note of this, that 80%, 80.8%. So we had about 19% conserved at that time. And this was the distribution. Dr. Rebozo talked about this. The distribution of conserved lands is skewed toward the mountain biophysical regions. We have lots in the Green Mountains, northern and southern, and in the Northeast Kingdom, relatively little in the southern Vermont Piedmont, that is the southeastern part of the state, and the Champlain Valley. And he also spoke about the elevational spread, that many of our conserved lands are at highest elevations because those lands are simply less productive for other uses. That's really just history. But going back, coming to a more modern look, this is 2020, so just a couple of years old, 2020 protected land, and this is not by protection class, but by ownership. This is data from the Vermont Land Trust, but you can see there is more conserved land. You can see who owns it. And then a summary of Vermont protected lands. And this is from a new report that is just about to come out called New England Wildlands. It is not out yet, but it's coming out soon, and I'm happy to share some data from it. That Vermont is about 5.9 million acres, about 15% of New England, and it's about 78% of is forest, and this is declining. I've heard different numbers on this, but in that range. So it's a range. But of that forest, about 79% of it is private and 21% is publicly owned. This is important information. And in all of Vermont, about 26% is permanently protected from development. And about 19% of that is working forest, about 4% of that is farmland, and about 3.2% of that is wildland. These are classes that were put together for a particular project, don't exactly match up with GAP, but approximately do. And here's,
Liz,
yes, go ahead.
we have a question from Representative Sibilia.
Can you, thanks, Liz. Can you go back to can you go back? Yeah. So just calling this out. So this permanent, the word permanent is there. And I mean, I'm seeing different slides with different uses of this permanent. So I just want to kind of put a pin here and say, I really need to understand this. What's permanently protected or permanently conserved, the words, and asking kind of the universe and you, Madam Chair, if there's some place that really can help me get the definitions of this, because it seems like it's pretty important to understand.
So the definitions, yes, and the numbers, part of why we need the plan is to really understand the numbers. So the plan would result in an actual inventory and understanding of the different classes of lands that have been conserved and where they fit in those definitions. It is a plan that we're talking about.
Yep, that's right. Keep saying that.
It is a plan to kind of put order and science into our conservation efforts.
Great.
So
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, and if I might address that briefly, Representative Sebelius, and one could go on for a very long time about permanency. So I won't, but there is a whole range of what that actually means. And when permanency is an elusive thing, there's no such thing as absolutely permanent in the geological sense, if you know what I mean. But we think about the most permanent kind of protection is ownership by an entity that can manage in the intended way, and oversight by a third party, which often involves a conservation easement. So it's sort of like wearing a belt and suspenders at the same time. That is the highest and best and most permanent level of conservation that I can think of. But there are other things that do count, like wilderness designation, for example, is pretty permanent, but it can be undone. So this is a great question to dig into at some point.
Representative Smith.
thank you. If you could back up one slide. You've got up there that all Vermont, 26.2% is permanently protected. That's pretty darn close to being on track for 30-30, isn't it?
Well, here's the rub. If you don't mind my saying this, that the work will be in determining which of those categories actually adequately protect the elements of biodiversity that we are concerned about. This is the detail that people have been talking about. So it's tempting to say that we're close at 26%, but it doesn't all protect biodiversity equally. So if you had, the ability to have as much GAP category 1 as you wanted, and we simply don't. But if you did, that would really be the easiest way, I guess I would say the most efficient and easiest way to protect many, many elements of biodiversity is through ecological reserve areas. We know that working forests can protect many elements of biological diversity, but the real work will be in the work that you are calling for in this bill is for the Agency of Natural Resources to direct an analysis of that, so that we really know what those working lands, what those lands in that third category that is the natural resource management areas. What is that correct proportion of those three categories that will best protect biological diversity? Right now, it's heavily skewed toward the third category, and I don't know that that is going to be the most effective. So that's going to be the real trick. It's figuring that out. So yeah, it looks like we're close, but not necessarily really when it really comes to protecting biology.
We're close, but we're not close.
That's well put, Representative Smith. Yes.
Thank
We're
you.
close in amount of land, but we need to know where it is and what it's doing. Representative Bongartz.
Hi, Liz. Can you go back to slide, I think it's 25? One more. Keep going.
Land by elevation.
That one. Oops.
This
Back
one.
to the other one. Nope. The land by elevation. Conserve land
This
by,
one.
Yeah.
that one. Yeah. And I just wanted you to talk for a second about why it's important to have land conserved, or in terms of maintaining biodiversity at all levels. Like, is it enough just to do the mountaintops? And if not, why is it important to go down to lower lands there as well?
Thank you, Representative Bongartz. As you know, because of where you are and the area that you represent, some lower elevation lands have very disproportionately high levels of biological diversity. For example, the Vermont Valley has a lot of biological diversity, but it's relatively low in elevation. The Champlain Valley has a lot of biological diversity in terms of species richness, in terms of state significant natural communities, diversity of species that simply do not occur at higher elevations. And so there's both differences and increased richness as you go down in elevation. We need to have all elevations represented. We've heard earlier about things like picknells, thrush, and so forth that occur at high elevations, very, very sensitive things at high elevations. I'm glad those elevations are all conserved, but we need more lower elevations for the things that are less well conserved. In terms of biodiversity. Does that answer your question, Representative Bongartz?
It did. I just wanted you to highlight that.
Thank you.
And then actually, while we have interrupted you, I would ask you to go back to the biophysical regions and just explain those and the numbers you have there and why it matters.
Yeah, so it's a similar thing. The numbers, the Vermont Conservation Design calls for a more equal distribution of conserved lands throughout the different biophysical regions. Not completely equal, because in some senses, the lands that are already intact, the ones in the mountains and in the northeastern highlands, are good candidates for large ecological reserves. But we really do need to increase what's in the lower elevations. What I don't have here, but you'll see if you hear more about the Vermont Conservation Design, is that in the eastern and western parts of the state, where those 9%, 8%, and 7% numbers are, and also in the Vermont Valley where the 10% is, you will find calcareous bedrock. It's a different kind of bedrock than occurs in the Green Mountains and in the northeastern highlands. And it is bedrock that supports a different array of natural communities, a different array of species, and increased biological diversity, just more species richness, more species per unit area in some of those places. And some of our best rich northern hardwood forests occur in that eastern part of the state. And in the western part of the state, in the Champlain Valley, we have things like limestone, bluff, cedar, pine forests, and dry oak, maple, limestone forests, natural communities that don't occur in the other biophysical regions. So it's important to represent all of them too.
Thank you. Representative Smith.
Thank you. It looks to me by that map that the Northeast Kingdom has already done its part, as has the Green Mountain Range. And it looks like we need to hammer on Chittenden County a little bit harder to get their percentages up. Would I be right in assuming that?
That I could conclude the same thing if I were to look at this. Yes, yes, I would say we need to up. We really do need to up the game in those biophysical regions, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're ready to let you continue.
Yes, and do give me the hook if you need to, but I am watching the clock, trying to keep.
No worries about that. No, we just may have more questions.
Okay. All right. So and this is going back to the data that were presented right here. This is the data from the New England Wildlands Project, this new project that's coming out, new report that's coming out. And this one just highlights wildlands and protected forest and unprotected forest. It doesn't do all the classes, but the wildlands are essentially gap 1 and some gap 2 lands. And so those are dark green here. And the lighter green is forest that's protected, but not in the highest, not in the wild, what they call the wildlands, what we call the wildlands category. And then zooming in on Vermont, you can see what's going on here. So the dark green are basically the wilderness areas. And if you would to zoom in, you'd see some other smaller natural areas. I think that even you could, if you zoomed in, you could see Peach and Bog natural area, but I won't do that. But generally speaking, and again, these are general numbers. Don't take them take them with a grain of salt, because we really still have work to do on this. But approximately, we have 26% conserved, protect, and they use the Wildlands Project uses the word protected. Here's again another thing: terminology is tricky. Protected, preserved, conserved, secured, all these terms are used interchangeably. I'm really happy to see that you have a definition in the bill that makes it clear what you're using, as you were advised yesterday by council, in the context of what you're using. So you use the word conserved in this context to mean protected and meeting the definition and as described above. And so I'm using these terms somewhat interchangeably because in practice they are. So it's just something we have to be, accustomed to. But anyway, Vermont protected lands from the Wildlands and Woodlands Project, approximately 3% in the wildland category. That's mostly gap 1, some gap 2. Working forest, mostly gap 3. That's 19%. Farmland, that's mostly gap 4, 4%, and unprotected 74%. So this is what approximately what it looks like currently. Again, these data need analysis, particularly. So the Wildlands, New England Wildlands report and project was focused on wildlands, focused on that gap 1 and gap 2 category. And so it had a slightly different purpose than this. They did not look at the other categories in great depth, but what they did with that first category was to look at every single natural area designation, every single wilderness designation, every single conservation easement that called for wildlands protection. It was a tedious job, but really, really fun work to do. I worked with them on it, and it was just really good work to do. And this is what we need to do for the other categories. And it's not, I say tedious, it's not hard work, but it's just, let's dive in. Let's actually look and see what we have so that we know how close we are to meeting some of these goals. But here's my recommendations. We do need permanently protected land, and I mean permanent as permanent as humans can do, and which is that belt and suspenders approach that I talked about. protected, you use the word conserved. And again, I'm using those somewhat interchangeably, but we mean protected from conversion to other uses. And we need to increase the total. That's clear. We need to increase the proportion of class 1 to somewhere between 9 and 10%. And this is called for by Vermont Conservation Design. In a sense, they actually use the term old forests rather than ecological reserve. But again, that's some translation that needs to happen. They call for old forests covering about 9% of the landscape, generally speaking. And in some cases, it might require work to get to that. In some cases, the old forests already exist and they simply should be passively managed or left as ecological reserves for ecological processes to occur. In other cases, that there's some restoration might be needed before that can happen. I think that we need to increase the proportion of class 2 lands, lands in which some management is allowed, but generally speaking, they're managed for the purpose of biodiversity. And this is what really needs analysis. So I think that shifting that balance from more class 3 to more class 2, and again, you know, I'm using class 2 to be really analogous with or comparable with natural resource management area as defined on page 6 of the version of the bill that I'm looking at.
Yeah.
We need to identify, go ahead.
I actually would like to just point out, I think that you're using a few terms to talk about the same things. And I want to just say, like, I think you're meaning class 1 to be what we're calling an ecological reserve area. Class 2 to be a biodiversity conservation area. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, that's correct.
And
I thank you.
a question from Representative Sakowicz.
Thank you, Liz. I'm really glad that with this slide, you brought up the class 1, 9 to 10% or more, referencing Vermont conservation design and how it does call for about 9% old forest. I actually been really wondering about that number, both in where it comes from, but even more, whether it really is enough. You alluded to the fact that we have many different forest types here in the state. And if we, set aside only a 9% goal, but then sort of divide that by all the different types of forests, it seems like we could easily find ourselves, missing important pieces in that category. So I would love to hear more about your thoughts about needing more and how that fits in.
Thank you, Representative Sakowicz. This is a great question. You will see that I put or more in a sort of vague sense. I think that is a really minimal goal for old forests. It mirrors quite well the regional goal of the Wildlands and Woodlands Collaborative, which produced the report that I've been talking about, the Wildlands in New England report, which calls for about 10% of the New England landscape to be in old forest, ecological reserve, essentially. But they have been in this new report, they are also talking about and analyzing whether that is enough and really questioning whether that is enough. It frankly, I'll be completely honest, and it is frankly a balance between the need and the practicalities. So it is not an arbitrary number, but it is also not completely reflective of science. It's a balance between science and practicality. Does that help?
Yes, but I would just love to underscore the fact that it does seem like that should be our minimum as a goal, not not to think that, oh, well, we've hit 9%, great, we're done, we don't need to do any more, because I do think that at least it seems to me, I'm not an expert, but that we will still be missing a good chunk of the forest types, if we limit ourselves to 9%.
I
my-
go ahead.
No, please respond. That's fine.
Thank you, Representative Sackowitz. I agree, and I also think that we will be missing things. I will, though, say that you will hear more about how this was developed in Vermont conservation design and specifics about, I hope, about how this number was arrived at. Also, there are very specific, if you look closely at the technical report for Vermont conservation design, there are specific goals for each biophysical region for old forests. And the next and work that really needs to be done is for each forest type, for each natural community type, how much of each is needed. And so those details, yes, have been dug into to some extent and will be more.
Great. And then to sort of follow up a little bit on the old forest sort of theme, we have lots of habitats that aren't forests, and that should also be allowed to become old. And so I'm just sort of wondering how that fits in. We don't really, we hear a lot about old forests, old growth forests, but we don't really hear so much about the other types of habitats that we have that would, I would think, very likely benefit from being undisturbed for very long periods of time. How does that all fit in?
Yes, could you give an example, just so I know what you're talking about?
Well, just anything that's not a forest. And you did talk about bogs and, and there's other kinds of wetlands and presumably grasslands. These are all these different types that exist in our state.
Good, very, very, very good point. Yes, and some of those, the like a couple of the bog and the fen that I showed you earlier, those are ones that need to be in ecological reserves. They need to be in the class 1. So if we have a goal of old forest of 9 to 10%, and then we add all those other habitats in that also need to be in class 1, then yes, absolutely, we're going to bump up that number. We're going to need more of the ecological reserve class, or at least the natural resource or the biodiversity conservation area class to accommodate, to best protect all of those other features.
Great.
Other features that might belong in there include, so we talked about old forests, we talked about state significant natural communities, and also riparian areas. Many riparian areas might really best go in that highest protection class.
Thank you.
Okay, so I guess the fourth bullet on here, identify features that need specific protection. And that's what we were just talking about. What are those features? What are those natural communities? And what classes do they each really, are they best protected by? And then, as we talked earlier, distribute the conserved lands by elevation and by biophysical region and by geology, even within biophysical regions. So I'm going to actually conclude here with just some of the sources and some of the information that's out there. This is old, 2002, but there's a lot of great information in this document, which is available just by Googling it. And but it's interesting. It is interesting to look at data that are 20 plus years old. But many of the concepts still apply. But this is sort of the underpinning of what we're doing now. The 2016 work by the Nature Conservancy and ongoing on their resilient and connected lands for terrestrial lands and waters. Actually, it is now for terrestrial and aquatic conservation. So it's been expanded since this. The Wildlands and Woodlands Partnership, Wildlands and Woodlands, Farmlands and Communities, published this report in 2017, which, as I said, somewhat mirrors some of our goals. And I would really encourage you to follow this and to consider joining in regional conversations about these efforts. I'll just say that I think that one of the things that the partnership is working on is really trying to forge more regional New England-wide partnerships. And I know that you've had conversations with adjoining states about this and so forth, but just really encouraging that. Vermont Conservation Design, this is the summary report from 2018, and worth, again, you know, I hope that you'll hear more detail about that. And then this work, which is I've mentioned, which is in press right now, Wildlands in New England, Past, Present, and Future, a report summary, and there will be a Vermont-based summary of this work as well. So look for that to come. And if there are any further questions, I'm here.
Thank you for your testimony. Do members have further questions? Representative Smith?
I do. Thank you. Thank you. That was a very interesting presentation. I have a question for you. What would you suggest that you might want to do differently to protect our waterways? If you started right now, what would you suggest we do?
Protecting our waterways, a key component of protecting our waterways that was identified in Vermont Conservation Design is protecting the lands adjacent to our waterways. So riparian buffers on our rivers and streams, simply reducing the amount of disturbance, of land disturbance on rivers and streams, and providing natural lands adjacent to our rivers and streams is probably the primary or the most efficient and effective tool for protecting our waterways. So that's my, I guess, my one-line answer.
All right, thank you.
Thank you again for your testimony. Very helpful.
You're welcome.
Right, members, we have one more witness this morning. So I'd like to take a 5-minute break and come back at 10 till to our